All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm sure we'll probably have a few other people coming in. We've had some people who bought some tickets that haven't showed up yet, so plenty of spaces for them. My name is Nathan Stalvey. I am the director of the Clark County Historical Association. I want to thank you all for coming out today. I think you're going to find this talk quite riveting. A very, very important part of not only just Virginia's history, but America's history as well. I want to thank the Barnes & Rose Hill for allowing us to host this event and many others here throughout the year. Thank you for letting us use our space. Thank you to Sarah and Morgan and Nathan for all the hard work that they do here. I do want to point out that outside there are some handouts. They are free to take. We've got some handouts from the Moton School. We've got some handouts on the Barnes & Rose Hills list of events. And we've got the Clark County Historical Association's list of events for the entire calendar year of 2022. I think you're going to find some really, really great topics and programs coming up. At this time, I would like to turn it over to Alyssa Buselli. Alyssa Buselli is our Suzanne McCown Education Coordinator at the Clark County Historical Association, and she joined us at the end of September and has put together our entire 2022 program schedule. So, Alyssa, come on up.
So, hello everybody. As you said, my name is Alyssa Buselli, new education coordinator for CCHA. So in regards to our program today, I'm going to introduce our speaker. Cameron Patterson is the executive director of the Robert Russa Moton Museum, which is a national historic landmark that preserves and constructively interprets the history of the civil rights education, specifically as it relates to Prince Edward County and its leading role, how their citizens play in America's transition from segregation towards integration. Since joining Moton in January 2017, Cameron has led the effort to grow staffing support to increase a presence across the Commonwealth, to solidify a thriving partnership with Longwood University, increase programming, expand resources from young visitors, and also museums where he has taken an active interest in promoting museum advocacy efforts at all levels of government. Cameron is actively involved in the local community and across the Commonwealth, supporting several different organizations and initiatives. He's a Lynchburg native in Virginia and graduated from Longwood University with a bachelor's in science and history and a master's in counselor education. So before we begin this wonderful talk, just FYI, so he will be answering questions after, and this is since it will also be a streaming event as well. We will be passing around a wireless microphone that you could talk into, so then our virtual audience could hear your question as well. So now I will turn it over to Cameron Patterson. If you'll give him a warm welcome, please. Thank you.
Well, good evening, folks. It is an honor to be here. This is the first presentation that I have given off-site since COVID started. So I am very excited to be here with you all. Prior to my trip here to Berryville and Winchester, I had not been here before. So a beautiful community, and I'm really excited to explore the community tomorrow, just to take in some of the sites that folks have mentioned so far during my time here. So again, it's really an honor to be with you. I'm here today to share a bit about not only the history of Prince Edward County, but the history of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and really the history of our nation. I titled this story, The Moton School Story, Children of Courage. This is the name of the permanent exhibit that we have on site at our museum in Farmville. And I think as I speak today, you'll really get a sense that when we talk about Moton School Story, Children of Courage, that this story is about young people. It's about young people who use the tools of democracy to bring about change. And for the students of the Robert Russa Moton High School, for the community of Prince Edward County, Virginia, that change would primarily come through our legal system. And hopefully you'll get a sense as I kind of walk throughout this story today that there are a number of ways in which individuals navigated the civil rights movement in our country. Some did it through the legal system. Some were more involved in direct action protest. And there are plenty of examples of that throughout this story that I will share with you. So there are different ways in which individuals navigate it. But primarily for Prince Edward, it was the legal system that they utilized to help push for change across the country. So again, I'm delighted to be with you. I come from the Robert Russa Moton Museum, Virginia's only civil rights museum and a national historic landmark dedicated to preserving and constructively interpreting the history of civil rights and education as it relates to Prince Edward and the leading role its citizens played in America's transition from segregation to integration. It is our vision at the museum to be a repository for historically significant materials that record Prince Edward's 13-year struggle to achieve civil rights and education. So we focus on that period between 1951, when the students of Robert Russa Moton High School go on strike, through 1964, when public schools open in Prince Edward County after having been closed for 5 years. The museum seeks to give considerable attention to advancements within our public education system. And we aim to commemorate the stories of the students and families whose courage and personal sacrifice was at the center of helping to bring about this change. As a caretaker of this remarkable story, our work is focused on the importance of engaging future generations in their understanding of this history. And through this work, we strive to expand upon the idea of what it means to be a citizen within our democracy. Citizenship, empowerment, and responsibility are just a few of the guiding principles at the heart of our permanent exhibit. And for this story, it teaches us that the rights of citizens must be affirmed and protected regardless of color, party, class, economic circumstance, just to name a few. And again, when I think of this story, it is about ordinary citizens who are using the levers of democracy to bring about change. I hope that you'll see through this story that it provides a good example, particularly to young students, that you too can play a role in helping to bring about change within your community. That change doesn't have to be on the scale of what Barbara Johns and her classmates did at Robert Russa Moton High School, but any change you can help bring for the community in which you live is important change indeed. And so I kind of like to start with this quote from James Baldwin just to kind of set the tone. The great force of history comes from the fact we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it, and that it is present in all that we do. And so as I share this story, I do so through the lens of two generations of students. We have the walkout generation, which features the story of Barbara Johns and her classmates who walked out of school on April 23rd, 1951, and set in motion a series of events that would culminate in the Brown decision, of which Prince Edward had a majority of the plaintiffs, and the lockout generation, which features students who were shut out of schools between 1959 and 1964. The sacrifices of both the walkout and the lockout generations helped to redefine equality for all and helped to really save our public education system. Their commitment to the principles and their resilience ensured that our education system remains a training ground for creating an enlightened citizenry. And so we share that Moton in Prince Edward County, Virginia, is the birthplace of the student-led civil rights movement and started what we would know as the modern civil rights movement. The courageous acts of those that went on strike happened 4 years before the Montgomery bus boycott, 9 years before the first Greensboro sit-ins in North Carolina, and 14 years before the Selma to Montgomery voting rights marches. We now know that the struggle for civil rights takes place not just on buses, at lunch counters, or on the streets, but also in the classrooms and courtrooms where young folks use those tools of democracy to bring about change. And so as I start this presentation, I think it's important to share that the significance of Farmville in Prince Edward County to American history is not just limited to the 20th century. The final days of the Civil War drew to a close in and around Prince Edward County, with the Battle of High Bridge being the last major battle prior to Appomattox. There was a community in Prince Edward County called Israel Hill, which featured a group of emancipated people who before the Civil War became successful farmers, merchants, and artisans. In the period following the Civil War, Reconstruction produced what Christopher Banista, in his book Southern Stalemate, would refer to as a shift in the social order. And so there were 27 blacks elected among the 180 new members of the Virginia General Assembly in 1870. And among those elected was a gentleman by the name of Tazewell Branch from Prince Edward County, who served 2 terms in the House of Delegates and who was also father to Mary E. Branch, a noted educator and the first black college president in the United States. Unfortunately, Tazewell Branch passed away early. And, I would like to think that had Tazewell Branch lived, Virginia State University, which is located in Petersburg, might have found its resting place in Farmville, because that was certainly an advocacy point that he was heavily pushing to have an HBCU in Farmville. W.E.B. Du Bois in the 1890s visited Farmville to understand better a rural black community and the origins of migrants to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, for research on his book, The Philadelphia Negro, and a report that he would publish for the United States Department of Labor. Prince Edward is situated in the Black Belt, a stretch of land that extends from the Chesapeake Bay through the Carolinas, Georgias, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and East Texas. Black Belt counties had high populations of black residents, and sometimes those black residents outpaced white populations. And I want you to hold on to that thought as we continue. Black populations outpace white populations, and that was indeed true in Prince Edward County. Farmville had a population of nearly 4,500 individuals in the late 1950s, which would be the time in which the students at Moton were beginning to craft these plans for that student walkout. And when you combine Longwood University, which at the time was a state female normal institution that specifically was focused on producing educators, that population increased significantly to nearly 8,000, a number that it currently resides at today. And so it's important to kind of know that the significance of Prince Edward County is important. And I point it out because when you look at the county and its early history prior to 1951, I want you to know that Prince Edward had a number of citizens that were advocating specifically for advancements in education for black residents. So this was taking place prior to the 1951 student walkout. And so here I show a photo of early life in a black school in Prince Edward County, just to kind of give you an example of what life was like in that school space. At this time, this would have been shortly post-Reconstruction, as our public education system across the Commonwealth was beginning to take flight. This photo was taken at one of the schools outside of the town of Farmville in the more rural parts of the county. And at that time, those were the only places that educational institutions for black residents resided, in these one-room schoolhouses on the outlier of town. And then secondly, I show a photo of our Virginia state capitol. And I share a quote from the Virginia Constitution of 1902 that says, "White and colored children shall not be taught in the same school." And it's important to share that because the Constitution of 1902 for Virginia was a defining moment in the way in which we provided education to black citizens across the Commonwealth. For the first time in our Constitution, we codify this notion that facilities must remain separate. And it's important that I share that because that Constitution of 1902 would really carry the Commonwealth of Virginia through this Jim Crow period. And it wouldn't be until the early 1970s that the Constitution would be rewritten, when Dick Howard, a lawyer from the University of Virginia, and a number of scholars from across the Commonwealth, including Oliver Hill, formulated a commission that rewrote that Constitution. So again, that Constitution sanctioned the creation of separate and unequally financed schools. Moton's facilities paled in comparison to nearby Farmville High School, located just a few blocks away. County officials dragged their feet on building a larger school, and instead they would construct these temporary classrooms that were mistaken as chicken coops. But despite the inadequacy, Moton students thrived in a nurturing environment that was created by their teachers, parents, and church communities. Teachers held students to high standards, encouraged them to pursue extracurricular activities, challenged them to seek a college education. Parents were at the forefront of helping to lobby for new education facilities. In this community of Prince Edward, particularly the students were inspired by World War II and America's victory. So the students in the community began to have rising expectations. They too wanted a piece of this American dream, and believed that they had the right to access it. And so I share two individuals here who are prominent individuals in this Moton story. The first gentleman is T.J. McElwain. He was superintendent of Prince Edward County and Cumberland County Public Schools, which is a neighboring county to Prince Edward. Farmville actually splits between both of those counties. T.J. McElwain came on in 1918. And so by the time we get closer to the 1951 student strike, T.J. McElwain was of the opinion that I have improved educational facilities in Prince Edward for black students. I have taken you from these one-room school facilities to this brand new standalone all-black high school that you currently have, which is Robert Russa Moton High School. How could you not be satisfied with this progress? So that was T.J. McElwain's thought on the matter. And then next to him, we have a lady by the name of Martha E. Forrester, who was president of the Council for Colored Women. That Council of Colored Women was the leading civic organization in the Farmville, Prince Edward community that was advocating for educational advancement. It was that Council for Colored Women that took us from having grades for black students in Prince Edward end at the 7th grade as of 1930 to being extended to the 11th grade and eventually the 12th grade. Now, the county would make black students and their families cover the cost of extending those grades, but nonetheless, she and that Council of Women were leading the fight for educational equality. So two individuals that were on the opposite side of this debate about making sure that this county lived up to this idea of separate but equal. And so as we start to kind of march towards that 1951 student walkout, I think it requires us to have an understanding of what was happening educationally during this time period in Prince Edward County. The Robert Russa Moton High School was built in 1939. It was the first standalone all-black high school that was built in the county's second brick building for black students. The school was built with funding from President Franklin Roosevelt's Federal Works Administration, which provided 45% of the financing of this new high school. And Robert Russa Moton High School is located on the left side. This was significant achievement for county residents, and white leadership within the county thought that building this school would be enough to satisfy black citizens. White leadership within Farmville and Prince Edward believed that they had done right by black citizens. J. Barry Wall, who was editor of the Farmville Herald, would often editorialize that black citizens were not contributing to the tax base at the rate in which white citizens were, and that was the reason that their fiscal plant was not up to par. But again, I want to pull back in that notion that a lot of these black belt localities had a higher black population than they did a white population, and that was true in Prince Edward County. So in Prince Edward County, we were educating more black students compared to white citizens, but the facilities told a different story as it relates to that. Local advocacy, again, has always been the hallmark for Prince Edward community. Led by Martha E. Forrester, led by that Council for Colored Women, led by civil rights leaders such as L. Francis Griffin and Mr. John Lancaster, both of whom were a part of the Prince Edward County Parent-Teacher Association. And so the students saw that their parents and community leaders were advocating for a new school to be built. But the students began to grow restless. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we were coming off of World War II at a time in which the expectation that students had was significantly increasing. And so it was with this that the students of Robert Russa Moton High School decide that it is time to take their education into their own hands, and they begin to lay the groundwork for this student walkout. And so I want to show here our two school facilities, Robert Russa Moton High School, and then you have Farmville High School. So these are the two schools that would most often be compared when legal efforts would begin on behalf of Prince Edward County. So you have the all-white high school, which is a mile away from the Robert Russa Moton High School. And again, I don't think this photo of Farmville High School does justice the way in which this building looked, the residential neighborhood in which this building sat, and all of the facilities that these students would have access to compared to the students at Robert Russa Moton High School. Moton was a one-floor building. We had 6 classrooms, an auditorium, and the tar paper shack buildings that the county would later add to the property to alleviate that overcrowding. So I want you to think about this. 180 students is what Moton was built for. In the second year of occupancy, that enrollment reached 215 students. And in the decade that would lead to the student walkout in April of 1951, that enrollment would reach 450 students that were attending school at Moton. And so I think this quote from Principal Boyd Jones really sums it up when he says, "Sure, we're crowded. You know that auditorium? Well, we held 2 or 3 classes in the auditorium most of the time, 1 on the stage, 2 in the back, and we even held some classes on a bus." So that was Boyd Jones, principal of Moton High School at the time in which the students walked out. And you can see a photo of what classroom life was like inside of that tar paper shack building. One of our volunteers at the museum, Mr. Bob Hamlin, who would later attend school at Robert Russa Moton High School, would remark that it was his responsibility as someone that lived close to the high school to come in to make sure that the potbelly stoves were filled with wood so that they were able to start their day. And when I hear that, I hear, for me, that inequalities placed responsibilities on students that attended black schools that weren't necessarily there for those students attending the all-white schools. You know, at our all-white schools, students had the most up-to-date heating and airing system for that time period. And so the responsibilities and the burdens were a little different based on where you went to school. And that's one example that Mr. Hamlin offers. I continue to share photos of life at Robert Russa Moton High School. So look at the auditorium. This is our main multi-purpose space at what is now the museum. And just sit and picture for a moment 450 students crammed into that space on a daily basis attending school in this building. Whereas at Farmville High School, you had a standalone auditorium, a standalone cafeteria. That auditorium, and you see the basketball rim in the back of this auditorium, that auditorium was the assembly space, it was classroom space, it was the gymnasium, it was the cafeteria. That one space had to be all of those things to 450 students that were attending school here at Moton. Additionally, at bottom, you see one of the 3 tar paper shack buildings that resided on the property at Moton. Those tar paper shack buildings, again, the students and community members referred to them as adult-sized chicken coops because of how poorly they were built. Now, as we continue to kind of march towards this student walkout that would take place on April 23rd, 1951, I like to point out this event that takes place within the Elam community of Prince Edward County. There was a bus accident that takes place on March the 19th of 1951. And it truly was a tragic event for Prince Edward County. This event was one in which a bus stalls on the train tracks, and the bus driver is unaware that on the other side of this hazy fog, there is a train coming down the track. And before he could get all of the students off the bus, the train collides with the bus and it kills 5 students. And so this is truly a tragic accident, one of those students being a very close friend of Barbara John's. And I mention this event because this is the first time for the students and for members of the community that you get a sense that inequalities are beginning to claim lives. This is a bus that was a hand-me-down from our white schools that likely should have been put to rest some time ago. But these are the types of resources that our black students had access to in Prince Edward County. And so for the students particularly, at a time in which they are planning this student walkout that's going to take place a month later, this is an example that inequalities are beginning to claim lives in Prince Edward County. And so the student strikers will often say that if there was ever any hesitation that they had about planning this student walkout, this is an event that solidifies their resolve to want to move forward, to want to improve their circumstance. So this is a very, very defining event for Prince Edward County. So a leader emerges. Barbara Johns, whose idea it was to lead this student walkout, steps forward. She puts together a strike committee of classmates that she knows and trusts, that she believes will be able to help her galvanize 450 students to walk out of school alongside her. Barbara recognized that collective action was an important thing when you're planning an event as significant as this. You know, think about the time period. This was a time period in which students didn't defy adults in the way in which these students were about to. And so Barbara recognized that in order for this to work, all 450 of her classmates had to walk out behind her on this strike. And so that's what Barbara and the strike committee were working towards as they began to put their plans in place. And I elevate just a few of the students that comprised that student strike committee. Carrie Stokes, who was a leader in the senior class. Her brother John Stokes, a leader in the senior class. John Watson, who was a leader at Moton. within the junior class. And so I elevate these students because they are students that comprise that student strike committee alongside Barbara Johns. And her sister Joan, when she talks about this walkout, she always is very immediately mentions that she had no idea that her sister was planning this event. Joan was in the 8th grade, Barbara was in the 11th grade. She had no idea that her sister was planning the event. So just imagine coming into the auditorium, if you're Joan, sitting where you're sitting, Barbara standing on this stage where I am, and sinking in her seat when she sees her sister emerge from behind the curtain. She said she had no words when she saw her sister emerge from behind that curtain. And so she said Barbara stood up there and addressed the school. She seemed to have everyone's attention. At one point, she took off her shoe. She banged the podium and said, "We are going out on strike, and would everyone please cooperate and don't be afraid, just follow us out." And so we did. The entire student body followed her out. And the students were so meticulous in their planning that the day after the walkout, they met at the bus stop every student that wasn't at school on the day of the walkout. They told them of their plans, because back then you didn't have a group text thread that you could keep everybody updated. They told those students of their plans and asked that they go home and not go to school. So just think, at 16 years of age, to plan the event that they planned that would be a catalyst to a monumental court case. Barbara and her classmates, they knew what they had to do because they saw those parents and community members advocating and recognized we've got to take things into our own hands. So following the student walkout, Barbara and a handful of folks go down to the superintendent's office and they demand a new school building. They then reach out to L. Francis Griffin, a pastor and local community member, and they ask him for his advice on what they should do next. And Reverend Griffin gives them the advice to reach out to Oliver Hill, who is a lawyer with the Virginia NAACP. And that's exactly what they would do. So you see this quote here from T.J. McElwain. They sent a bunch of children over to see me. There wasn't enough room in my office, and so we went upstairs to the county courtroom for a meeting. Barbara did a good deal of talking. They were asking questions like why couldn't they go to the white high school, and I had to explain that we have to live by the laws and that it was a matter of Virginia statutes. I said we were going to get them a better school and as soon as we could. And I want to read this letter that Barbara and Carrie Stokes would send to the NAACP the same day of the student walkout. They said, "Gentlemen, we hate to impose what you're doing, but under the circumstances that we are facing, we have to ask for your help. Due to the fact that the facilities and building in the name of Robert R. Moton High School are inadequate, we understand that your help is available to us. This morning, April 23rd, 1951, the students refused to attend classes under those circumstances. You know that this is a very serious matter because we are out of school. There are seniors to be graduated, and it can't be done by staying home. Please, we beg you to come down at the first of the week, if possible, Wednesday, April 25th, between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. We will provide a place for you to stay. We will go into detail when you arrive." Oliver Hill, Spotswood Robinson did make that trip to Farmville on April the 25th. Now here's the thing that makes me laugh. Oliver Hill, Spotswood Robinson, they show up with the Dean of Virginia Union, and they tell the Dean to stay in the car because we don't think this is going to take long. So they go in, and they are so impressed by the resolve of these young students that they later decide to take on this legal effort. Oliver Hill, Spotswood Robinson had plans for a community down in Pulaski that they thought would be what Prince Edward would become as it relates to Brown. And so they were on their way to make their visit there. But as things kind of fell apart in Pulaski, they were able to turn their attention back to Prince Edward. They always questioned whether or not Prince Edward would have the resolve for a serious legal fight. But thankfully, the interactions that they would have with these young students, and eventually at a community mass meeting held at First Baptist Church, would change their tune. Now, in my opinion, if you think the student strike is impressive in terms of what these young students were able to do, this mass meeting gives me chills when I think about the fact that as a 16-year-old young student, Barbara Johns takes to the pulpit of First Baptist Church. In the Baptist tradition, particularly at this moment in time, you didn't give over your pulpit typically to anyone that wasn't clergy. And to give it over to a young female student was even more radical at this time. But she takes to the pulpit. And there are folks in the audience that don't believe that we should be taking on a legal effort. And Barbara responds to those individuals, and she shares why she believed her and her classmates did what they had to do as it relates to walking out. And what I love is that Francis Griffin, the pastor of this church, follows behind her, and he says to the congregation that any man who would not support these students is a coward. And he would use that pulpit throughout the duration of this legal effort, throughout the time in which schools were closed, to help the community as they navigated what was in front of them. And he did it to the detriment of his job. He did it to the detriment of his own health. But he felt that the church, as an anchor for the Prince Edward community, had a responsibility to support the students and what they were seeking to do. Now, I just want to kind of walk through some of the evidence that would be used in the local case, Davis versus County School Board of Prince Edward, that would then combine with 4 other communities to make up Brown v. Board. So in Prince Edward, you see that the county invested $306 per student for black students, while they invested $1,679 for white students. And you see the property value, doesn't even reach $200,000 for what was invested in Moton, surpasses $400,000 for what was invested in Farmville High. And again, more students attended Moton than Farmville High. You see the physical plant and the differences between Moton and Farmville. You see that Moton had no cafeteria. You see the cafeteria that students had access to at Farmville. No gym at Moton. What would have been a state-of-the-art gym at the time at Farmville High. One science classroom at Moton that only had one microscope that the teacher utilized, whereas at Farmville, you had a science laboratory that had ample pieces of equipment for students to utilize. And so the photo evidence in the Davis case told the story that this country was not living up to this notion of separate but equal. And again, I share the Davis plaintiffs. So these are the brave souls from Prince Edward County who, along with their parents, because they were not considered of age to be plaintiffs in their own right at this time, these are the brave souls that would become plaintiffs in the Davis case, which would combine with 4 other communities to make up Brown v. Board. So when we hear of the Brown, we often think of Topeka, Kansas, because it's the lead case. But in Prince Edward, this locality produces 75% of the plaintiffs in Brown v. Board, and it was the only student-led of the communities that would join together. So you had Briggs v. Elliott from South Carolina. You had Bowling v. Sharp, Davis versus Prince Edward, Belton versus Gephardt, and Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. So Brown comes down in 1954. And so a banner day to think that we are at a moment where we have broken down this notion that was codified with Plessy v. Ferguson of separate but equal, and that our public schools will now be integrated. But let me tell you what, boy, were we in for the fight of our lives as Virginia enters into this period that would become known as a massive resistance. And so you see that reaction from leaders in the Commonwealth. The highest court of the land has spoken, and I trust Virginia will approach the question realistically and endeavor to work out some rational adjustment. That was our Attorney General, J. Lindsay Almond. The decision will be deplored by millions of Americans, and instead of promoting the education of our children, it's my belief that we will have the opposite effect in many areas of the country. In Virginia, we're facing a crisis of first magnitude. Senator Harry Byrd. And so as Virginia enters into this massive resistance period, at the museum, we would share this period from a local perspective, a statewide perspective, and a national perspective. Virginia was very adamant that they did not want to become what was happening. They did not want to become Arkansas in the way in which Eisenhower had ordered federal intervention to eventually integrate public schools. And so the Commonwealth of Virginia, through the legislature, did everything that they could to push back against this notion of integrating. They passed laws that gave the governor the ability to close any public school that sought to integrate. They changed the pupil attendance laws so that white students and black students did not have to be educated together. They pushed back against the NAACP and put out messaging that would seek to have folks think that the NAACP was this radical organization that was looking to kind of mess up the social fabric of our country as it relates to this issue of segregation and integration. And so the Commonwealth was meticulous in their ability to push back. But thankfully, federal courts would intervene, and they would declare many of these laws put forward during this time period as unconstitutional. And so in an address by then Governor J. Lindsay Almond, following the court's decision to render massive resistance effectively dead within the Commonwealth, he shared this during that radio address. To those whose purpose and design is to blend and agitate the white and Negro races and destroy the integrity of both races, to those who disclaim that they are integrationists but are working day and night to integrate the schools, to those who don't care what happens to the children of Virginia, to those false prophets of a little or token integration, to those in high places and elsewhere who advocate integration for your children and send their own to private or public segregated schools, to those who defend or close their eyes to the livid stench of Satanism, sex, immortality, juvenile pregnancy, infesting the mixed schools, to those who would overthrow customs and morals and traditions of a way of life which has endured in honor and decency for centuries, and embrace a new moral code prepared by 9 men in Washington, referencing the Supreme Court, whose moral concepts they know nothing about, to those who would substitute strife, bitterness, turmoil, chaos for tranquility and happiness of an orderly society, to those who would destroy our way of life because of their pretended concerns over what Soviet Russia may think of us. Interesting given where we are currently. To all these and their Confederate comrades and allies, let me make it abundantly clear for the record, now and hereafter as governor of this state, I will not yield to that which I know to be wrong and will destroy every rational semblance of public education for thousands of children of Virginia. I call upon the people of Virginia to stand firmly with me in this struggle. Be not dismayed by recent judicial deliveries. The words of our then governor, J. Lindsay Almond, as massive resistance began to crumble within the Commonwealth. The governor would utilize his powers to close schools in Warren, Charlottesville, and Norfolk, seeking to close those schools that were in the process of being integrated. And so these communities join with Prince Edward as having had their schools closed. And so again, we see that fall of massive resistance in January of 1959, where the governor has to bring back the General Assembly into session to act on recent decisions by the court. And then we kind of march towards the moment where Prince Edward County closes its public schools in order to avoid integrating. And you can just think about how a decision to close public schools for 5 years not only impacts the generation in the moment, but has a further consequence, which I would argue that we still feel today within our community of Prince Edward. And I want to read to you a quote from the Attorney General of the United States, Robert Kennedy, where he says that we may observe with as much sadness as irony that outside of Africa, south of the Sahara, where education is still a difficult challenge, the only places on earth to not provide free public education are communist China, North Vietnam, Sarawak, Singapore, British Honduras, and Prince Edward County, Virginia. So with the school closings in Prince Edward, certainly disproportionately impacts Black students, but it certainly has an impact on the entire community. Even though we do have a private school that opens, not all families can afford to send their children to that private option. And so from there, you have individuals such as L. Francis Griffin that step forward to assist in the operation and creation of these training centers that were operated as moral builders for out-of-school students. And many of the children were educated by local women who taught them in their homes, in their basement, and in their shops. Dr. Martin Luther King visits Farmville in March of 1962 on a tour of the South Side. And he says in his visit, "Things will get better, do not despair, do not give up, but just stand firm for what you believe in." And people all over the United States will say there are black people in Prince Edward who have injected a new meaning in the veins of civilization. We see the reemergence of student activism with protests that take place in downtown Farmville, led by our youth community. We see Prince Edward Academy, a private option for white citizens, open during this time period. And I want to end with a voice from someone that was impacted by the school closings in Prince Edward, as she shares her perspective during that time.
My name is Dorothy Lockett Holcomb, and I live in Farmville, Virginia. And I've lived here on and off most of my life, except when I went away to college. When the mid-50s, when the decision came that schools had to be integrated, Prince Edward County decided to go into this massive resistance gear that lasted for 4 years. And then they decided if we have to integrate, we are going to just not have public schools at all. So in 1959, I was 10 years old, 4th grade, and totally devastated without a school to go to. But my life before that was going to a 3-room school in my little neighborhood, which was Prospect, Virginia. And we had, 6 grades in that one little school, 3 grades in one room and 3 in the other. We had old dilapidated books that we used, but that was life, and we walked to school every day and we learned. We had excellent teachers. So when this decision came down and they decided in 59 that schools wouldn't open, I was really devastated because I loved school and didn't know what I was going to do. And thankfully enough, I had parents who were very supportive, and my dad was said, no matter what, we're going to make sure you get an education. We're going to make sure you go to school. And so I didn't really know what he meant by that, but I found out real soon that when it was time for schools to open, we actually went to the basement of a church to be tutored. And every day when I passed by my school with padlocks on the door and all the equipment gone, and I was walking a mile to school before schools closed, and then I was walking 3 miles to a basement of a church and 3 miles home. So 10 years old is kind of hard to do, but we did it. And we went from having a desk to just church pews and tables, and we made do with what we had to do. And I did that for 2 years, thinking that schools were gonna open, but they never did. And my oldest brother was about 17, and he decided he wasn't gonna do that anymore. And so my dad figured out something else to do, and my father worked for the railroad, and he worked it was about 18 miles from our home in a little place called Pamplin, Virginia, which was in Appomattox County. And so he rented an old house there, and he would drop us off at that old house every morning. We pretended to live there so we could go to school. And it was not fit to live in. I'm testifying to that. I mean, you could see through the floors, the dirt. and you could, going upstairs, it just was really creaky. And the windows were broken, and so it wasn't fit to live in, but they did a lot to try and make it look like we lived there and put up a mailbox, and he would have to drop us off at this house, and we would hide out behind the house, and when we heard the bus coming, we would go through the back door and out the front door and pretend that we were living there and get on the bus and go to school. You know, I didn't understand about the color differences, and I just knew what my parents told me, and I realized years later that they were kind of sheltering me from a whole lot, and that they were saying, my dad was saying not to worry, that you treat each person as they come to you, and don't judge anybody by what they look like. He was instilling that in me, and even though he only had a 7th grade education, he knew. Even when schools opened in Prince Edward County, free schools in 63, I'm sorry, we didn't come back to Prince Edward to go to school. And the only thing my father said to me is that I'm not going to give him a chance to do that to you again.
The magazine that some of you were able to pick up documents stories like the one that Miss Holcomb shared. And so I hope you'll read through those stories to learn a bit about the experiences of those that were impacted by the school closings. If you were unable to get a copy, we do have them available, along with 3 other volumes of that magazine on our museum website under the Learn section. And so we do hope that you'll take a moment and engage with that. But I do want to end here, and I do want to open it up to you all for any questions that you might have.
All right, who wants to go first? I saw this hand right up here.
Okay, thank you. I was curious if Longwood College at the time, did they remain silent during this period? Was there any advocacy? Did they stand up for any of the students? Anything?
That is a good question. Our president, W. Taylor Reevely, would be the first to say Longwood was not on the better side of the angels during the time, particularly that schools were closed. So that was just a silence as all of this unfolded. And when I think about that, I just think to myself, how could an institution whose main purpose at that time was to train teachers be silent as public schools closed in their own community? Interestingly enough, the president of the university during the time in which schools were closed took a leave of absence to go to Pakistan to help open schools in Pakistan, while schools in his own community remain closed. So that is a history that we have to overcome each and every day. The university did publicly apologize in 2014 for the role or the lack of role it played during this time. That apology was then able to lead to the museum and university entering into this affiliation together. And I think our president, I've heard him often say this, that we as an institution, Longwood, has to show every day with our good deeds and with the values we profess that we are not what we were. So that is work that has to continue each day. But Longwood was not where it needed to be during that time period.
Thank you. Is this on? Anyway, at the first of your remarks, you said that the blacks in Prince Edward County and elsewhere outpaced the white population, but I never understood what the metric was and what basis they were outpacing them in terms of
Just in terms of
education?
school, just in terms of students enrolled.
I see. Okay.
Just in
thank you.
terms of students enrolled. So I think at the time, particularly, at the time in which Moton was built, I don't think white leaders in the anticipated how many black students would take advantage of this educational opportunity. The belief is that World War II had a lot to do with it, particularly for our male students. Teachers were encouraging students to take advantage of these opportunities. And so, yeah, when we say outpace, it's solely on the number of students registered in our public schools.
First, thanks for the talk. Very interesting and very valuable. To bring it back to home soil, I think I know the answer to this, but I'd like somebody in the room to correct me if I'm wrong. What were the last 3 jurisdictions to integrate the public schools in Virginia? The year was 1967, and to my knowledge, the 3 jurisdictions were the city of Danville, Warren County, and Clark County. Am I correct on that? I just want to bring it back to home soil.
Yeah. When I think of that, I think Prince Edward closed for 5 years and still became one of the first to integrate in '64 when schools were reopening. Thank you for that.
Thank you. This was wonderful. Actually, my wife and I took a trip down to Farmville.
Oh, excellent.
And the museum was closed that day. So now that we've met you, we're going to come back again. And if it's closed, we're going to find you and get you to open the door.
I tell you, when you come down, any of you in this room, email me, and I will give you a guided tour.
That's what I was looking for,
down.
that invitation. That's great. Thank you. Also wanted to ask if there's any sort of commemorative walkout on April, whatever the date is, either in Farmville or anywhere else.
So that's a good question. So in the Commonwealth of Virginia, April 23rd is Barbara John's Day. So that was signed into law during the McAuliffe administration. And so during that day, we do try to commemorate in a statewide way Barbara John's and the students that went on strike on April 23rd of '51. We try to do that in terms of community programming, our K-12 programming. And so, additionally, we also encourage communities to mark that moment for themselves. And I think when you mark that moment, it doesn't have to just be about Barbara John's and the students of Prince Edward. It can be about history in your own community. I think one of the rich things when people come to the museum, they often end up sharing or feel inspired to learn more about issues of school desegregation in your own community. So, every community has a story to tell. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Over here.
This is a comment, not a
Yes, ma'am.
question, and that is, as I listen to this history, I'm profoundly uncomfortable. So I'm wondering if we can't teach in the public schools in Virginia today history that makes our students uncomfortable, how can we get, this history out? Does it fall more squarely on the shoulders of something like our historical associations and, come back to, like you're saying, tell your local story? How will people learn?
I'm geared up for the fight that this moment is bringing. And we have been dealing with it recently, me and my team in our work, folks pushing back against what we're doing. But, I think it's important, at the end of the day, this is history. When I talk about these things, I'm using the words of individuals that were on both sides as it relates to this history. So, we're geared up for the fight. We're ready to push back because I think it's a responsibility that we have as a museum institution to teach this history, the fullness of it. We will continue to be supportive of our K-12 partners that might not feel that they have, I'm not a school employee, so I don't have all of those things to deal with. So we want to be supportive of our K-12 partners who might feel a little concerned in the moment. But I also would say I think a little bit of discomfort is important, as we experience this. And, I think that I would say to folks, when you feel that discomfort, I think that gives me a little bit of hope to know that you kind of come to this with a genuineness to want to learn more, and hopefully leave here feeling compelled to share this story with others that might not have encountered it. But, again, we are geared up and ready for the fight.
Thanks. I was wondering, I didn't see much about the administration of the Morton School, and I can imagine when I was 16, standing up to my teachers and saying we're walking out. So I just wondered who they were and what was happening and how did she get permission to even do this?
So she did not get permission. So I think that was probably one of the toughest things for these students, to know that you were doing something that would defy your leadership and potentially put them in harm's way. They wanted to protect their school leadership as much as they could, which is the reason that they chose to keep this secret from all adults, except for the small group of students on that strike committee that John Stokes, one of the strikers, referred to as the Manhattan Project because of how secret they had to keep things. But let me just kind of give you a little creativity of how that day unfolded on April 23rd. So again, October of 50, they start planning this endeavor. So on April 23rd, John Watson leaves the school and he phones back with a disguised voice that tells the principal, a few of your students are down at the bus stop causing a disturbance. We need you to come down and check it out. And so he rushes out because he knew that if the police got a hold of them, they would end up in the Farmville jail. So he leaves out. Barbara circulates a note to the teachers signed BJ. In her mind, that's how Boyd Jones signed his notes. Her initials were BJ, so she didn't feel that she was doing anything that was, she didn't feel like she was lying or being deceitful when she sent that letter around. And so the teachers release the students into the auditorium, and she appears from behind the curtain. The football players escort the teachers out of the room, giving a nice, gentle nudge. And then she proceeds to share why she felt her peers needed to follow her. So they were very creative with the way in which they deployed. They had their protest signs already created, hiding out in one of the tar paper shack classrooms. And so they were ready. They stayed out for 2 weeks. In that time, the NAACP becomes involved. They encourage the community to fight for full-on integration. And then once the NAACP becomes involved, they tell the students that it is better for the case if you're back in school. We have a better chance to put forward our best argument if you are not violating truancy laws. So So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, I was. Yeah. Okay. You mentioned in that the Virginia Constitution of 1902 prevented black and white students from being educated in the same institution, and I'm curious, what opportunities did black students have to go to colleges or universities? I know around, I think in Harpers Ferry there was Storr College that was historically associated with the black community, but I'm curious, were there multiple other institution or colleges that were mainly associated with black communities, or yeah?
That's a good question. So most students from Prince Edward County either went to St. Paul's College in Lawrenceville or Virginia State University. Those are the two HBCUs that have the highest concentration of alumni within Prince Edward County. So your HBCUs were your collegiate institutions that were available to students. Longwood University, right next to Moton, didn't graduate its first black student until 1972. So, you know, Joan Johns Cobbs, Barbara's sister, tells our president, and she says, you know, I applied to Longwood. Longwood denied me. So HBCUs were the main educational outlet for black students. And so, you know, now we would say to a student that there are a multitude of opportunities available to you, not just a 4-year education, but at the time, you know, college was the main post-secondary experience that was pushed for students.
Thank you for your important talk. I'm interested in how two different societal institutions reacted to the strike. The first is law enforcement. Were any of the students arrested? And were there any acts of violence or threats of violence at the time? Then secondly, how did the press react? The state and national press. Did they try to ignore this, or was it widely reported?
Those are great questions. You know, I would say, and as I come back, I might need you to recount again. I'll start with the press. You know, J. Barry Wall, editor of the Farmville Herald, was a pretty well-known figure within various corners of the Commonwealth, and was an individual that would use the editorial pages of that newspaper along with Kilpatrick, who was the editor of the Richmond News Leader, the evening newspaper in Richmond, to kind of carry forth a lot of the language during that time that we see in our politics today. You know, they framed this not as an issue of white and black. They framed this as a states' rights issue. States and localities ought to have the right to be able to determine for themselves where students attend school. So, you know, he used the paper based on the events in Prince Edward to kind of help shape some of those arguments. School choice argument around the time in which schools were closed. You've got private academies that are opening across the Commonwealth. And I would say in the wake of the student walkout, very dismissive of the strike, the reasons for the strike, and constantly came back to this notion that Prince Edward was working to solve the issue. And so, you know, media plays a very important role in terms of how things are framed during this time period. And I'm going to ask you to... So I think one of the reasons that Prince Edward often doesn't get talked about as it relates to other seminal moments of the civil rights movement is because there were no major acts of violence. We had instances of cross burnings on the school front lawn. Barbara and her family, their home vandalized at the hands of an arsonist. So we had some events, but we didn't have major moments of violence like we would come to know in places like Montgomery, Mississippi, other places. And so I think that's why you often don't see Prince Edward elevated in the conversation. As it relates to law enforcement, the students that were there on the day of the walkout said that Barbara equipped that the Farmville jail isn't big enough to hold us all. So, if we go on strike and we do this together, all 450 of us, that's not something that we'll have to worry about. Now, when the protest movement of the 60s came to our community, when schools were closed, you did see examples of students being arrested as they sought to integrate lunch counters, as they sought to gain entry into businesses and establishments within the downtown area. And typically, in that moment, they weren't put in the Farmville jail. They were put in jails in outlying counties that connected to Prince Edward. All of the protest photos from the protest of 1963 in downtown Farmville are police surveillance photos. So police officers putting community members into plain street clothing to gather that photo evidence. And we were fortunate that someone found that photo evidence and thought to donate it to Virginia Commonwealth, which has made it available through their digital archives.
So I've actually got a comment to the audience and a question for you, Cam. Comment first, something I wanted to point out that happened when we were marketing this event. Alyssa and I were marketing this event, and when we went on Facebook to promote it as an event, we suddenly got a rejection from the Facebook advertising. It says, this is, and an algorithm determines that this talk is in violation of their policy on promoting events that deal with social justice. Apparently that is a no-no considering Facebook advertising. Well, so when you get an ad rejected, you can always request a manual review, and so Alyssa did that. We had it reviewed, and an individual reached out and said, your ad is still denied. It has been reviewed 3 times, and it is still denied because it violates our social justice policies. And we looked at the ad, and I think many of you have seen the ad. It states exactly what this is about, and it really raised some red flags about what can be, somebody had mentioned, how is this history, how can we teach this history? That raised some red flags for us. We're like, well, okay, how, not only for us, I'm looking bigger picture. How would the Moton School be able to promote their events if that's a policy? How would other African-American museums and institutions be able to promote their message? So I do 2 amazing things happened after that. Number one, I want to give a big shout out to Michael Faison and the local chapter of the NAACP. I reached out to them. We got together, they invited me to their meeting, I showed them exactly what was said in the ad, and he was like, yeah, that should not have been, that's very concerning. So I was able to state my case. We were able to promote it, and they promoted it amongst their members, and again, I really want to thank them for helping us get the word out about that. And then, luck as have it, suddenly, in a very, very rare instance, Facebook writes me personally and says, we made a mistake. We're very sorry, your ad is approved. So that's definitely going to go down in the annals of something that never, ever happens, but it's still very concerning that something like that would happen. And I did speak to somebody at another museum who said that when they tried to promote their talk on Loving versus Virginia, that was also denied by Facebook. So it's a very scary time when you think about it like that. My question for Cam is just a real quick question. After all of this, what became of Barbara Johns?
It's a good question. I will first say that Facebook is a blessing, and sometimes it can be the devil. And we've just gotten to the point where we just had to hire people to help us write those ads in a way that gets past their algorithm. So I appreciate you fighting the fight, because hopefully that will help others outside of just your museum. But I will say, following the walkout, due to concerns for her safety, Barbara would leave the community, and she would go to live with her uncle Vernon Johns in Montgomery, Alabama. So one would ask, if the concerns are safety, why does she go to Montgomery? And I think it's important to just kind of remember that this was prior to the Montgomery bus boycott and a lot of the pivotal moments that we would see in the civil rights movement. Interestingly enough, her uncle was pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. The congregation fired him because they thought he was too radical when it came to civil rights, and they would then go hire Martin Luther King, who kind of took that to the next step. So her uncle was, a famed theologian, the first black theologian to be recognized in the 1920s. They published a report that just kind of featured some of the top sermons from the year, recognized with that honor. And so she would go live with him. She would go to Spelman. She later became a librarian in the Philadelphia public school system. But she led a quiet life. She didn't really talk about this. She felt that she stepped forward in her moment. I think this story is a great example of you are constantly passing the baton to the next person that steps forward, that continues to take this journey forward. So wasn't until later in life that she really began to talk about what had happened with some interviews and things of that nature. But unfortunately, she would pass away in 91 due to a courageous cancer fight.
I have a question. First of all, whenever I come to events like this, I often look around and see that most of the people are my age. And it's a little disconcerting because I hope that we can teach the generations behind us. So when you said that you're ready to take on the fight, I just wondered, what is that fight? How can we help get this message in an abbreviated fashion, of course, to our schools? And can we do it through a concerted effort statewide? And how can we help do that? I live in a building in Strasburg, and which some of you here have visited. And one time I had an event, and a man thanked me. He thanked me for letting him come in the front door because he had only ever come in the back door of that building. And he was younger than me. And even one of my sons in his 50s, I mean, they think we're talking about hundreds of years ago when many of us lived through this. And so I just wondered, when you say the fight, how can we all, in a concerted way, maybe each county gets a little group together, I don't know. How can we make our state be willing to tell these lessons in a way that's meaningful and not just not in a long, instructive, way, but vignettes, I suppose, vignettes of personal experience like that lady?
That's a great question. I'll first start by just saying that when I first started at Moton a number of years ago, it really put it in perspective when, my colleague, our director of education, said to me, he said, I'm 27 years of age. My father was 22 years of age when he graduated from Prince Edward County High School after being impacted by the school closings. While interning at Moton and doing some research, he discovered that he is the grandson and the nephew of three plaintiffs in the Brown v. Board of Education case. And so, to just kind of learn that familial connection really put it in perspective that this history isn't that long ago that we talk about. But, I would say, to gear up for that fight, I think it's important to support museum and cultural institutions in your communities that are doing important work. So, making sure that the Clark County Historical Association has access to be able to work with our K-12 populations is important. Making sure that localities make investments in our museums and cultural institutions. We've made a lot of progress, particularly on the Moton front, in terms of getting this history in our curriculum for K through 12. We got to make sure that we don't turn the corner as it relates to that. And so, I would say to anyone, when folks show up with this anger and this hatred and this demand to push back against teaching our full history, we've got to show up with equal energy and match that. So I think, to me, that's a part of this fight.
Hi. First of all, I have to say thank you for that wonderful presentation. It really was inspirational to see youth show leadership qualities and move forward. And I was thinking while I was sitting there watching the students, well, what about the parents? Well, the parents came eventually and supported them, but I'm sure those young people got those leadership qualities from home, from their parents. So I think that was very good. Just wanted to say a couple things. First of all, my parents moved here at the time of integration from Pennsylvania to Virginia. That's because we had family here. And that's when I heard the story about Warren County, which was really crazy to me. I didn't believe it because I started school in Pennsylvania. We didn't have segregation, so I knew nothing about it. It was a very diverse school district. But coming to Clark County, coming to Virginia, I heard about the story in Warren County. And then in '67, and I'm dating myself, I went to Virginia State University, and my roommate, my freshman roommate, was from Farmville. And she was telling me she went to school in New Jersey, and then she told me a little bit about the story. I thought, that's crazy. I just could not understand it. I do now, but back then it was just something I didn't understand. I'm certainly glad to hear you say you're going to keep up the fight, because just recently I had the privilege of going into a school and judging an activity on Black history. Well, 3/4 of the classroom participated. It was an optional thing. Well, there was this group, a grade level group, I'm not going to mention names, but a grade level that chose not to. Now, I'm an educator. This grade is particularly important with learning history. And this group of teachers decided they were not going to participate. So I'm thinking, in a society where we're supposed to be celebrating diversity, and we can't even support our young children who are from other cultures, what does that say to kids? I walked away from that feeling very, very angry, and I don't know what my next step is going to be. But I can't let children sit in that classroom and teachers not participate and not give them the history that they rightfully deserve. And most of it is more about your historical figures and a lot of the history that they don't know. But the most important thing is it starts in the community, it starts at home, and more importantly, it starts in the schools where we educate our children about the history so they can learn to understand the differences and they can learn to respect and appreciate, yes, there are differences, but that's okay. This is America.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, and thanks as well for recognizing Mike Faison with the NAACP. A question was asked about how do we get education as a right through the county, through the state, and also about the history of the contributions that have been made. I have a few brochures. I did not come here as a representative of the NAACP, but I happen to have a few brochures because I am a member. And I will gladly, at the end of this, stand in the back for anyone that is, excuse me, that is interested in that. One thing that, beyond getting involved locally, supporting those institutions like the, excuse me, the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley. They have a wonderful exhibit going on right now that, unless you're on their Facebook page, you're not necessarily knowing all of the great things that have been done right in the Shenandoah excuse me, Shenandoah, sorry about that, in the Shenandoah Valley, and I highly recommend taking advantage of that. It's free on Wednesdays, so you don't even have to pay, but it's also a great venue if you want to become, so sorry about that, if you want to become a member of the MSV. Thank you.
This may have been covered in your introduction, but I understood you to graduate from Farmville. Is that correct?
No.
So, sorry.
So I'm a Lynchburg native.
Okay.
And a proud EC Glass High School graduate in Lynchburg. And I went to Longwood University. So that's how I came to Farmville in '05. And then have just been fortunate to be able to remain in the community since that time.
What led you to Moton, to that your current position?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I worked in higher ed, so I am a career switcher in terms of stepping into museum work. So I worked in higher ed, and I worked in our multicultural affairs office in a number of different areas. And, just felt like I wanted to be able to do something that was community facing. What I love about museum work is the community engagement piece. A big believer that museums are community anchors, and that museums have to respond to the needs of the communities in which we serve. So, it's that external facing piece that brought me to the museum. I felt like being at the museum, particularly at Moton, was an opportunity to be able to practice what I had preached to students about being civically engaged in the community around them. So, I've been very fortunate to be at Moton. I used to ask myself often, I don't know if museum life is what I will aspire to long term. I'm certainly changing my mind towards that, but I'm a Moton man, and I believe in Moton. I believe in the work we do there, and so feel very honored to do it.
Thank you. I liked what you said in the beginning about how one person can make a difference, and we look at Barbara as a good example of that. And when I look around the room, and we're mostly white people here, I remember thinking, I don't know where to begin to tackle social justice issues in a world where there's such hatred and racism. And my husband and I took one step a few years ago, and we did join NAACP. We stood in the background. We were very quiet. We just didn't know how to approach even supporting NAACP. But we learned about allyship, and we learned that to speak up. If you see something, you say something. You don't stay in the background. And not to promote NAACP specifically, but as an example, they gave us an awareness. And what you think you're not a racist, or you think you're not saying something racist, or you're ignoring something, you know, it woke us up. And we go, you know, we need to say something. There are things we can do. We may not be a teacher or an educator. We may not be a historian, but we can share, we can communicate, we can go to events like this, we can say something to a neighbor that they may not have been aware. So I think for a group like this, if you hadn't thought about doing something with your talk and being just one person, you go to an event like this, you go to a school board meeting, and you see an injustice and you say something. And I think your encouragement of your standing up to do a fight, we're ready too. You know, we'll join NAACP, and I encourage anyone else to join an organization that is social justice minded and speak up, say something. Don't let it just sit without being challenged.
Well, I love it. I am a proud lifetime member of the NAACP. And, you know, when last night we had a program for our branch in Prince Edward where we honored Reverend J. Samuel Williams, who was one of the student strikers and a founding member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee during his time at Shaw University. And Reverend Williams said that, you know, Reverend Griffin, who I spoke about in the presentation, when he was at the courthouse facing some legal issues in retaliation to the leadership that he had been providing to the students and within the community, the judge looked at him and he says, "You're not associated with that NAACP, are you?" And Reverend Griffin says, "I am a proud card-carrying member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People." So I think that's one great example of ways in which you can serve. And there's so many others. And I love hearing about just some of the ways in which everybody finds a way to give back to make a difference.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to turn it over to Alyssa for some closing remarks.
I've loved everything that I've heard and seen today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Loved everybody's comments. I'm going to go off a little bit. If there was any one thing positive about Donald Trump's administration, it was that it became 100% clear how racist this country still is. And it's not always overt, although being called N-word has just become so popular even on the internet. But underneath, there are forces trying to keep black and whites apart. Because race is not the enemy, greed is. So these folks are trying to bleed this country using, my son calls it fear porn words, like fear and the extreme left and you gotta save your country. That's a bunch of malarkey. So in addition to helping your neighbors when they say those out of the behind things, straighten them out. Tell them no, that's not true. And read. There are thousands of books coming out almost daily about the history of this country and all the miscreants who are trying to take us back to the 1800s. Thank you.
So I want to thank you for speaking today and everybody for participating in the question portion. So we have some events just so you're aware coming up. So we have a virtual event it's called It's Your War Too, the women who fought in World War II. So that's going to be a virtual event through Zoom and live streamed on our Facebook page. We also have a companion exhibit opening up in March 21st, so featuring some of the objects from these women who served locally. Another event coming up in March called the Fabric of America. We're having a series, so it's the Fabric of America series, Fashion and Social Culture in the 19th Century. So this is looking at how women in this is part one. So the 19th century, how fashion and how culture and how the advancement of women and the culture in the United States. There will also be 2 more events of that coming up in September as well, featuring early post-American Revolutionary women and the women of the modern day women from 1900 to 1940. Coming up in April, in the 9th, so Civil War Medicine and the Body, so that will be another event. And as usual, Spring Art Show we have coming up April 23rd to May 8th. And then we also have 2 more event just recently we booked in November for the Slave Dwelling Project will be coming up at the Mill. And also the material culture of African Americans in the Shenandoah Valley, which is in May. Correct, yeah, May. Along with our Miller School, which is also, those are both May 14th. So that's some things coming up. We also have a Prohibition event coming up this June as well. And I will hand it over to you if you want to say a few words.
Yes, again, thank you everybody for coming out. We'll still be around, available if anybody wants to come up and ask any questions to Cam or Alyssa or I. But again, we thank you all for coming out and enjoy the rest of this lovely day. Thank you.